I'm glad that we can have you back for another episode. I feel like it just was happening the other day where we did your other episode, but
Yeah.
it just so happens that we have two Chef Lisa episodes back to back, and the topic today we're talking about debunking common cooking myths. So the format, why don't you go through the format of how we're going to go through the episode today?
Yeah. So I kind of compiled a list of some of the most common cooking myths that I've kind of heard people talk about, and then sort of made it a true or false format. And I have the answers. You don't know them, although you might know them. So I'm hoping we can kind of do it like a little quiz format, see if you get them right, and then I'll explain the answers.
Yeah. I hope that I don't get obvious ones wrong. That would be kind of embarrassing. But hey, perhaps I'll clear up an inconsistency in my own mind. And as I've said before, a lot of times these episodes that I do with the team, these podcast episodes, I learn things that I can then use with my clients and even in my own life later. So I'm not going to act like I have all the answers because there's no way that I will be able to have all the answers. That's why we have a team to fill in all the gaps.
Yep.
Love it. Okay. How do you want to go about this? Do you want me to read them and guess, or do you want to read them off and then I'll guess? How do you want to go about it?
You can read them off, and I'll
Okay.
get, or do you, whatever. If you want to read them, or if you want me to read them and quiz you, if that's easier. Yeah, I'll read them, I guess, since you'll be the answering
Sure.
the questions.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Ready for the
Yeah.
first one?
Let's do
Okay.
it.
True or false? Washing raw chicken will remove or reduce bacteria.
I so my answer is well, I'm assuming you mean washing as in rinsing in a sink.
Yes, not washing with soap.
Yeah, okay, because I've
Yeah.
seen that. And
Oh.
I've seen that on TikTok. I don't really know if it's a joke. I hope it's a joke because
Ooh.
yeah. I'm gonna go with no. I would actually say that it might actually spread more bacteria around your kitchen. That's my guess. So I
Yeah.
would say false.
Yes, correct. So it is false. You pretty much nailed it. That's exactly it. So there is definitely like it's sort of an old wives' tale now, kind of an older generational thing, where people will rinse chicken before cooking, thinking that it kind of removes that excess bacteria. It might remove a tiny bit of the surface bacteria, I guess, but I mean, bacteria is all throughout meat. So it really isn't going to do anything other than spread the bacteria around your sink or around your surfaces of the kitchen. There's always going to be, water splashing places. It's going to end up on your clothes, maybe, or on your faucet, whatever. So really, that's a bigger risk than anything. So it really that those risks outweigh any potential benefits, which are basically none. so,
Yeah.
so yeah, it doesn't do anything. And if you're a kind of person who's like, this chicken's kind of seems like it's starting to go off, I'm just going to rinse it to rinse off all that bad stuff. That's going to do nothing. And yeah, if it's spoiled, it's already spoiled all throughout, and rinsing it isn't going to fix that either. So you're right on that one.
I would love to know where that came from because I've heard it many times, seen it. Yeah. In anyways,
Yep.
good, very good.
Okay. Yeah, that one I don't recommend. So if you're a person who washes your chicken, maybe it's good news for you to know you can eliminate a step in your food prep. You don't have to do that. In fact, you
Yeah.
shouldn't.
Yeah, which means that you don't have to clean your sink afterwards because
Yeah. Yep.
skip that
Exactly.
step, please. Yes. Good.
Okay. Ready for the next one?
Yeah.
Okay. True or false? You should season your food as you go.
That one's true. I think that one's true.
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, nothing bad is going to happen if you wait to season your food at the end. So, I want to clear that up right now. It's not like you're doing it wrong necessarily if you wait to season at the end. But seasoning as you go gives you a better flavor profile. And this sounds counterintuitive, but you're probably going to end up adding less salt to your food if you season as you go versus if you season at the end. That the reason being is basically just osmosis. Salt kind of absorbs into things as it's cooking and kind of seeps into it, gets into things. So it's seasoned all the way through. So I'm talking like pieces of meat or pieces of potato or pasta, vegetables. Give the salt that chance to kind of get into that food, and then it's properly seasoned. So when you take a bite, it's seasoned all throughout. So if you aren't seasoning as you go, if you don't have any seasoning in there, you wait till the end, add salt. Maybe your sauce or your broth will be seasoned, but all the little pieces in there are probably not going to be very well seasoned. So there's kind of that imbalance, and then it'll make your taste buds kind of think, oh, this needs more salt. It's kind of bland still. You're going to add more, then it still needs to dissolve and kind of mix in, and you're probably going to add more than you need. Like, have you ever done this thing where you season it, then you have leftovers, the next day you eat it, and you're like, why does this taste saltier the next
Yeah.
day?
I
Yeah.
was going to ask that actually. I was going to say, is that why some people find that their leftovers taste more flavorful or even more salty, like maybe to the point of too salty the next day? And as you were describing that, I'm like, oh, that makes sense as to why that happens if you don't season until the end.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And I've done that before too. I'm like, what is going on with these leftovers? Why are they so salty? And that's usually because you're waiting till the end to season. So there's
Hmm.
no real exact science to the seasoning as you go, other than just sort of like some of the bigger steps along the way. You want to just add, you don't need to add a lot. A little pinch here and there. Like, so when you're sauteing your veg in the beginning, add a little pinch then. When you add your broth or you add your tomato sauce or whatever it is you're making, add another pinch then. And just small amounts as you go. And then you'll notice at the end when you taste it right before you're ready to serve, you might not even need to adjust the seasoning at all, or if you do, it'll just be a tiny bit. So that you are right. True, you want to season as you go.
Hmm. And I think that's a good tip that to keep in mind for those people that may be concerned if you season as you go, you end up adding more salt, and then you makes the sodium content of your dish higher. But if that ends up making it so what actually happens is you may end up using less because you don't get to the end of the dish and realize, oh, this is bland. You dump a bunch of salt in, and it still might not be quite there to the points that you made about having it spread across the dish. Then you end up using less, or at least you have a little bit more control over the flavor profile. I think that's an important point because I know some of the people that I've talked to, not even just clients, like family members, friends, they may be hesitant to season food as you go because they're worried that they're going to be adding more salt than if they were to just add it at the end. But
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
it sounds counterintuitive, I know,
yeah.
but it's true. Yeah, like if you're, and I mean, I do recommend going gradually. Like you do want to do small amounts at a time. So I would say if your recipe, let's say you were following a recipe that calls for a teaspoon of salt in the whole recipe, maybe in some of those steps you add an eighth or a quarter of a teaspoon at a time. And you might find you don't even need that full teaspoon in the end. Maybe you can get away with half or three quarters of a teaspoon and you're
Mm,
cutting it way down. Whereas if you were following the recipe and it just says add salt as one of the steps, you might just dump that full teaspoon in following the recipe, and that's too much. So that's a good way of kind of doing it to the level that makes the most sense for your own taste too. So yeah, you are right.
nice. All right, next one.
Okay, leftovers. Leftovers are safe to eat as long as they don't smell bad.
That's false. There's because I know uh, there's a difference between food safety and just food quality, which is more like spoilage versus like this can actually make you sick kind of thing. And there's a lot of obviously there's bacteria that don't make any smell when they are doing their thing. So I'm going to say false because I would assume that there's some obviously where it would be unsafe if it smells bad, but there's probably some that are sneaky that don't have a smell but are still not good to eat. So that's my guess. I would say false.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah, exactly. And you made all the exact right points on that too. So our senses are not a good enough indicator on their own for spoilage. Lots of bacteria you can't see, smell, taste, any of those things. So obviously, if it very obviously smells bad, that's a good indicator that it has gone bad. So if it gets to that point, it's probably way past where you want to eat it. But yeah, we just don't know, and there's so many factors that affect this, right? Like the freshness of your ingredients that you're using, was it stored properly? Lots of different things that can affect the shelf life of leftovers. And
Mm,
then each individual is different too, with how much bacterial load they can handle in their own bodies. So some people are immune compromised or have chronic disease, and they can handle a much lower bacterial load than somebody else. So it'll be very individual to each person. Some people, maybe they can get away with storing leftovers for a week and they're fine. Other people more like 2 days, and that's kind of where they want to cap it. So it really is kind of individual, but I would say a good rule of thumb for storing leftovers, assuming they've been stored correctly and safely, is about 3 to 4 days in the fridge for optimal safety. Some foods are less than that. So seafood items are usually 24 to 48 hours. And some mixed dishes that have a lot of things going on, like if there's mayonnaise and dairy and cheese and seafood
mm.
and a whole bunch of things mixed together that all contribute their own fun amount of bacterial load into the cocktail, those also are like a more high spoilage food. So you want to kind of give those 2-ish days. So that's kind of the rule of thumb. You can give or take according to your own life and your own, whatever works for you in your life. But that's kind of what I stick with.
Makes sense to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're tempted by the things that you can't see or smell. But yeah, the human nose and human senses are only there's limits.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
all right, next up.
Okay, next one is searing meat seals in moisture.
Yeah,
Have you
that's
heard this one
false.
before?
I've
Yeah.
heard
Okay.
it all a
Yeah.
ton. I was brought up on this point. Um, I used to work at a butcher shop when I was younger, and obviously get this question all the time when you're talking about cooking methods. And there's probably confounding things going on that are impacting the moisture content of meat, whatever type of meat it is. But to my knowledge, from what I've can remember, I'm going to say false because I think moisture content of meat is not necessarily related to searing. I think that's more flavor development. Am I right?
You are right. Yes. So I like clearing this one up because it is still a very commonly believed myth that I still hear people saying it a lot. Some people in my life still believe this, and I correct them a lot. So I think the belief behind this one was because, like, when you sear meat in a frying pan or in the oven, it like creates this crust on the outside of the meat that's sort of like crispier, and so, like, because of that physical indication of almost like a shell,
Mm,
I think it sort of has tricked people into thinking like, oh, it's all like all that moisture in the meat is now trapped inside that hardened outside crust.
yeah.
So the visual indication, it sort of tricks people, but no, it doesn't. It doesn't trap in any moisture at all. Meat is still porous, no matter what. So, right, like you said, searing just develops the flavor. That's all it does. I really highly recommend that you do sear your meat whenever you have the opportunity to. It creates some delicious flavor compounds that really transform your cooking. So it does take a bit of time, but I think it's a like very well worth it kind of thing to add into your steps because it develops great flavor. But yeah, doesn't do much at all for trapping in that moisture.
I mean, if you use a dry cooking method like grilling, and then you leave your meat on a plate afterwards, and there's juices on the plate, that if searing meat worked, then theoretically there wouldn't be any juices on the plate afterwards.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't do anything. Yeah, it's just for flavor. it's definitely a great thing to do, but it's just for flavor. So clearing that one up, hopefully all the people listening are now going to drop that belief if they if they had that belief.
Look elsewhere for sealing and moisture. I think we got a point on that one coming up somewhere. Maybe. I can't
Yeah,
remember. But yeah.
sort of a related statement.
Okay. All right. Next up.
Okay, next one. You should not use a glass cutting board.
I mean, if you want to protect your knives, then I wouldn't use a glass cutting board. I mean, you could, but it would, if you want to dull your knives like in an instant. So I would say true, you should not use a glass cutting board. I want to be careful of the double negative there. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
know some of these
true, you
statements.
should not use the glass cutting board. True. Yeah.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. So, I mean, I hate to say never, but so you can use it. You can use a glass cutting board if you're just using it for like serving as a serving board, basically. But
Yeah.
you don't ever want to chop on a glass cutting board. It is the fastest way to dull your knives, as you said. I actually just watched a video on this the other day. It came up totally randomly after I'd already made these notes. And it was a person basically testing this theory out. They had a razor sharp knife and they cut. So before doing anything, they cut through a piece of paper and it cut like perfectly straight. And then what they did was they basically just pretended they were cutting something like they normally would on any other cutting board on this cutting board, like nothing crazy, just sort of a gentle rocking motion on the cutting board for 10 seconds. And then she took her knife and put it through that same piece of paper and it barely would go through. And it was that fast. Like it was just, it immediately dulled it. And I mean, that makes sense. Glass is such a dense substance. It's so hard. It's just bending over that edge on your knife basically, and that's
Yeah.
what creates the dullness. Is your edge is just curling under, and that's exactly what happens. So please don't use glass cutting boards. You want to use wood. Plastic is okay too, but ideally, like an end grain wood would be the best thing for your knives.
Yeah. Not to mention the sensory nightmare that is chopping
Oh,
on a glass cutting board, like the
totally.
loudest thing in the kitchen
Oh
next to
yeah.
your hood fan above your stove, probably. Like that was,
Oof.
yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
like nails on a chalkboard sound too, like
yeah,
just the scraping. Oh, yeah, it's it's not good.
yeah. Okay, that was the, yes. Okay, next up.
You're doing good so far. Okay, next one is it is okay to wash a cast iron pan. And maybe I should add to this one. Okay to wash a cast iron pan with soap, let's say.
Ooh, this one's, I feel like this one has, what's the word? This is a controversial one. I have seen people get in arguments about this before. But I'm going to say true. It's okay to wash a cast iron pan with soap. There's probably methods of washing a cast iron pan that you'd want to stay away from, but soap doesn't sound like it would be an issue for cast iron pans. That's
Yeah.
my guess.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And it's so funny. I feel like you're reading my mind because I was going to also say this is a very controversial topic and maybe people are going to come after me for this one. I don't know. So yeah, depending on who you ask, there's a lot of different opinions out there. There's a few like sort of things to keep in mind with washing cast iron. So you don't want to soak it ever in soapy water. So if you have something
Right.
really stuck on, lots of people will soak their dishes to loosen that up. You never want to do that with a cast iron pan. So there are some things that you want to avoid, and you want to avoid like really harsh detergents. Like if you have a really extra strong grease fighting soap or something, and then you squirt half the bottle in there and you're really going after it, like that's gonna not be great. And what I want to really say is that you can damage the heck out of your cast iron pan if you want to. You can throw it against a wall. You can whatever. They're pretty they're pretty tough. And so even if you use the harshest soap you have, all that's going to happen, and the only reason people discourage this is because it breaks down the seasoning on your pan. So the seasoning is that buildup of like a little layer of oil that's basically polymerized to create sort of a hardened surface that kind of acts like a non-stick surface once it's built up enough. So this takes time as you cook with it more and more. But that's built up of oils basically. And so soaps are surfactants that break down oils. So the fear is, oh, I'm going to lose all that seasoning that I've built up in my pan. So
Could it be such that, like, if you haven't seasoned your cast iron pan properly, those may be some of the people that have washed their pan with even a little bit of soap and lost their seasoning, but it's because they didn't season it properly from the beginning?
it could be that, yeah, like if you have a new pan, your seasoning is going to take a while to build up. Like some come pre-seasoned or some come not seasoned, and they give you instructions on how to build up that first initial layer. But truly, like a really well seasoned pan does take time to get to that point. So yeah, that's probably those cases where it would maybe start to break down that very thin layer that was already there to begin with. So those people probably didn't have a very strong layer of seasoning on their pan. So it started to kind of break down with that soap. But if you have a really good layer of seasoning, washing with soap is not going to destroy that seasoning that you have on there. And especially if you're doing a brief, like what I usually do when I wash my cast iron pans, I actually don't usually submerge it in the water, although you can do that. I usually take like my cloth or my scrubby that's in the soapy water and take that out and just like swish that around the inside of my pan. If it's really stuck on, I'll put it in the water and kind of like scrub it a little bit, but not for any prolonged period of time. But it's always fine. So that, yeah, I want to clear that one up, although I might get some hate from people on that one.
We'll see in the comments if people are disagreeing with that one. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Okay, next up.
Okay, the next one. The main purpose of marinating is to tenderize meat.
Ooh. Now, is this marinating like just a simple soak in a plastic bag in the fridge kind of marinating?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Um, dang. I know there is tenderization that happens with marinating, but to me, marinating means flavor as the main purpose. So I'm going to go false.
Yeah, you're right. So this one is a tricky one. And this one is interesting because there's sort of a few different things. So marinating with an acidic marinade, people think that it's going to tenderize their meat really, really well. And there's a small element of that. It does sort of break down muscle fibers a little bit, but it really only happens on the surface of the meat. So it doesn't really penetrate into the meat at all. You're going to get, like, if you did it overnight, you're going to get like a millimeter into the meat of tenderization. And the other piece of that is you have to be careful with acidic marinades because it can really start to break down the proteins in such a way that they become chalky in texture, kind of mushy.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it can actually have like an adverse effect if you overdo it. So really, marinating is more for flavor. Little bit of tenderization, I guess, happens if you really want to maximize the tenderization of a marinade. You want to cut up your meat into small pieces so you have increased surface area. But even then, I would recommend just doing it mostly for flavor. In fact, marinades actually have gone back to like ancient times. The origin of that was really for like preservation of foods.
Right.
Like the acidic marinades would have just been to slow bacterial growth, which obviously isn't something I recommend now that we have refrigeration and things like that. But yeah, it's mostly for flavor. So marinating is great, but you don't necessarily need to do it for days on end and hoping that you're going to have butter tender meat. It's just going to be it's probably going to actually make the texture not great the longer you let it sit there. So I prefer marinades that actually have like a bit of oil and a bit of a salt component, because this, like soy sauce, for example, because through osmosis, salt is going to travel into your meat and give you some, almost act as like a brine, so that it doesn't tenderize, but it helps you retain more moisture through, just because the salt ions are holding on to the moisture in the meat. So it's sort of like a pseudo brining, and the flavor travels in. So those are the benefits of marinating, but I wouldn't do it for tenderization.
Makes sense, especially considering what we've already discussed earlier about seasoning. That makes a
Yeah,
lot of sense. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, all these things are coming full circle, hey?
Yes. Yes. Okay, let's go to the next one.
Okay, you're getting 100% so far. Okay, the next one. The main source of heat in chilies does not come from the seeds.
Correct. True.
Yeah, you got it. So that one is also a common myth. Um, People think, oh, you got to take the seeds out, and then your spice level is going to go way down. That's kind of true, but the main source of heat actually comes from the membranes of the chili. So that's those white, pithy parts that are kind of where the seeds are attached to, basically.
Mm,
That's where the heat is concentrated the
right.
most. So if you really want to cut down on the heat of your chili, just, I mean, take the seeds out too, because they're going to be attached to that membrane. But really just cut out that membrane and you can just chop up the flesh. There's a little bit of heat in the flesh, but that is the lowest concentration. It goes basically flesh and then seeds and then membrane. So there is more in the seeds compared to the rest of the pepper,
Mm.
or the flesh of the pepper, but the membranes are where it's at with the heat. So that's I think that one came as a surprise to a lot of people when they learned that one.
I mean, think about what you're doing when you're taking the seeds out. Most people are going to be scraping that out with a spoon or something like that. And of course, what are you doing at the same time when you're taking the seeds out? You're scraping the pith out,
Yeah,
which is
right.
also going to take some of the heat out. And if you leave the seeds in, you're also probably not going to do anything to it other than just chop it up or dice it up. So you're also going to be leaving the pith in there, or the white membranes. So it's a, what's the word? It's a confounding, no, confounder? Yeah, it's confounding. So
Yeah.
you're doing something else alongside it, but it's not the actual thing
Yeah, I
that's
could see how
changing it.
people would make that association just
Yeah.
because they kind of are a package deal. So they
Yeah.
kind of come together. But I mean, I guess if you wanted to have the heat of the membrane and take the seeds out, you could kind of pick it out with your hands, and that would be one way to do it, I
Yeah.
guess. But yeah, yeah, that's the way to reduce the heat. If you're not, if you're not into the spice level from the peppers, that would be the way to do it.
Yes. Okay. We got a few more. I think we can crush these ones out before they end.
Yeah, I mean, if we're running out of time, we don't have to get to all of them. If there's, you want to pick one or two, do you want me to do one or two more instead of all of them?
Sure. Yeah. Pick the one or two of the maybe in an area that we haven't talked about, or the one of the things that may be more common. I'm good with your choice on that.
Okay, I'll pick we have four left. I'm going to pick two. First up, sharp knives are more likely to cut you than dull knives.
I false. I got to make sure I'm looking at the wording properly. I was that person in school that read questions incorrectly and thought I had the correct answer, but I just read the
Me
question wrong.
too. Me too.
So sharp knives more likely to cut you than dull knives. That is false, because you don't require as much pressure when you're using a sharp knife because it's sharp, less likely to slip whatever you're cutting, even if you have good technique, than dull knives. Although you can make the argument that sharp knives are more likely to actually penetrate and slice through more flesh on your hand or whatever else, but then you don't need much pressure. So that's my answer.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, no, and you hit the nail on the head exactly with that. Like it's you can cut yourself with a sharp knife for sure, but it's
Yeah.
less likely to happen. And if you do cut yourself, you're actually less likely to like get a deep cut. It's probably going to be like an incidental like little nick just from like
Mm,
because your hand accidentally got close to the blade in some way, but you're probably not going to be like really digging in like you would with a dull knife. Like you said, I don't
yeah.
really need to expand much on that. You're going to be pushing down harder and working harder, putting more elbow grease into it with a dull knife. And then if you slip, which is likely to happen, it's going to end up probably going onto your finger. And that hurts so much more. I have done that and it's not fun. Whereas a sharp knife is just a tool that is doing a lot of the work for you, and you're just kind of guiding it where it needs to go. You're not putting too much force. So, I mean, all knives need to be respected, sharp or dull. You need to always be present in what you're doing and paying attention. But the sharp knives are less likely to cut you, believe it or not.
More control, slower movements
Yeah.
means you can predict where the knife's going to go a little bit easier, which means, oh, if it does slip, you're not going so quickly. Maybe you have time to move your hand out of the way.
Exactly. Yeah. So keep your knives sharp is the moral of that story.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
There's many a hill that I will die on with knives that we could talk about, but that's for another episode.
Yeah. Okay, last one. Ready?
Yep.
You're nailing all of these. Okay.
Mm,
Last one, and this kind of is full circle from one of our last ones we talked about. You should let cooked meat rest before cutting into it.
please, yes, that's true. 100%. Absolutely need to rest. Yep.
I'm just realizing I have a lot of meat related questions for and you're vegan, so it's sort of funny to be going over
Funny
these.
how
But
I keep getting these correct, even though I
yeah,
am a vegan. Wow.
well,
Hmm.
you worked at the butcher shop, so we'll say from experience.
There was a point in time where I wasn't, and yeah, that point in time was when I was working at the butcher shop. So a lot of
Yeah.
knowledge retained.
Yep. Well, you are right. So you get 100% on the test. You should let your cooked meat rest before you cut into it. And this has to do with the juices coming out of the meat.
Mm,
So if you want to
from that
retain all
seared
that
meat.
moisture, yes, exactly. Yes. All that seared meat that is not holding in the juices,
Yep.
it will all that juice is going to come out really quickly if you cut into your meat right away. So you want to let that sit pretty much every cut of meat, but the larger the meat, the longer the resting time. I think that's pretty obvious. Chicken breast, you want to let rest 5 to 10 minutes. A large roast, like 30 to 40 minutes, maybe, tented under some foil. So you can slice into it. It's not piping hot. It sort of firms up a little bit, and all those juices don't just come pouring out. So it all kind of redistributes in the meat and stays in it rather than pouring out, and then you end up with dry meat. So that one might be an obvious one, but thought we'd end
I
on
don't
one that
think it
isn't
is.
controversial. No, okay,
I for some reason I don't think it is, and well maybe it's one that people know but they don't do because it takes more time, of which you may not always account for when you're making your meals. Like, oh, I have to wait 30 to 40 more minutes to eat my
right,
meal because I got to let the meat rest. And it's like
yeah,
it's a quality that, like, you can still eat the meat. It's not unsafe to eat it
no,
right away. It's
right.
just it's better if you
Actually,
wait.
that's a good point because and many cooks, and including myself, are very like timing oriented, where it's like food must be served hot when it's ready, right? So when
Mm,
that goes kind of against everything you know about food prep, it's like it's piping hot right out of the pan. You want to serve it when it's like freshly cooked and everything is at its best. So that's generally what we want to do with food that we've cooked. But with meat, it's like it's going against everything that you feel like you should do, where you're like, everything is ready, everything's hot, it's steaming, it looks great. I want to serve it right now when it's like just freshly prepared. But yeah, and it is also tempting. You want to cut into it right away. It smells so
yeah.
good. You're hungry. You just worked in the kitchen for however long. But I urge you to give yourself a little bit of that time to let your meat rest, and it'll be a good payoff.
Well, that's why you tent it or cover it with something. Like, part of the reason I would assume is to keep some of the heat in during that process, right?
Yeah. Oh, and sorry, that reminds me. The other reason behind this is not just for moisture; it's also for carryover cooking, for larger roasts and things like that.
Mm,
Obviously, with chicken, you usually cook it to the internal temperature you need, or maybe a couple degrees below. Let that rest, and it'll come up to temperature because the meat essentially cooks itself as it sits with its
right.
residual heat that's already in the meat. So if you're doing a roast and like let's say your recipe says to cook it until it gets to let's say you're going to 140 Fahrenheit, you want to pull that out when it's let's say 130 or 132 or something. Then when it rests, all that carryover cooking is going to take it up to 140. So that's the other reason we let our meat rest. If you take it out at 140 and that's the final temperature you want, it's going to rest for 20 minutes and it's going to go up to 150 and it'll be overcooked. So I mean, that's a
Mm,
whole other topic, I guess, but that's kind of part of the reason we let our meat rest as well, so that it can reach the proper temperature and kind of finish that cooking process.
that's a good point to remember too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So many so many little tidbits to cooking that are just so neat. I think we can well, safe to say that, like I mentioned before, we could probably have a whole nother episode of a whole bunch of different points. But I think, what, how many did we go through there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I think. So, yeah, 10 points that are kind of still scratching the surface of cooking. I'm sure there's a lot more. But I guess that means that we can bring you back for another episode and do this all over again.
Oh yeah, we can talk. I can talk about food all day long, as you know. So I'd be happy to come back and chat more food topics anytime.
Wonderful. Well, let's leave it there today. And I'm looking forward to see what kind of response we get with some of the answers that we discussed.
Me too.
I'm excited. I'm excited to see what happens.
Me too. Well, thanks for having me on today.
Yes, of course.